Hello and welcome to Telesur English. I am Estefania Bravo in Quito, Ecuador. This is from the south. Venezuela has announced it will allocate part of its gold held in the Bank of England to help fight the COVID-19 pandemic. Our correspondent Leonel Retamal has more from Caracas.
Venezuela announced it reached an agreement with the United Nations program to allocate more than $1 billion retained of gold in the Bank of England and allocate him to a program to fight against COVID-19. The government of Venezuela had announced that this money that is in gold was not able to be used because of actions by the country's right wing. But in the end, an agreement was reached, and this money will be used to fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2011, former President Hugo Chavez ordered the repatriation of all of Venezuela's gold located in other countries. This is the last reserve abroad that will be used to fight against the pandemic.
Correspondent Leonel Retamal for that report. The great housing mission of Venezuela's Bolivarian Revolution has hit a new milestone, having reached 3.1 million homes today.
The home number 3,100,000 we have in Monagas State in the El Corozo neighborhood of the municipality of Maturin. Sectoral Vice President Aristobolo Esturiz is there with the beneficiary families to unveil number 3,100,000. May 28, 2020, in the middle of the battle against the pandemic, Venezuela reaches home number 3.1 million.
3.100.000. 28 de mayo 2020. ¡Que viva la patria!
The fourth Iranian oil tanker has entered Venezuelan waters, bringing fuel and other supplies related to the production of the commodity. The ship, named Faxon, is being escorted by the Huaquerí PO-11 patrol boat of the Bolivarian National Armed Forces, and it continues course to the Amuay refinery. Meanwhile, the third Iranian oil tanker, Petunia, has just arrived to El Palito refinery at 12:35 local time. The fifth and last Iranian tanker, named Clavel, is on its way to Venezuela. The fleet is carrying more than 1.5 million barrels of oil in total. More details on the arrival of the tankers in this report.
On Saturday, May 23rd, the tanker named Fortune entered Venezuelan waters. It was the first of the 5 cargo ships bringing gasoline and supplies to Venezuela. It docked on Sunday, the 24th, at El Palito refinery and began to unload, which will help supply the demand for gasoline in the country. The Bolivarian National Armed Forces have closely followed the arrival of the shipments, guaranteeing that their arrival to the ports transpires smoothly.
We have perfect millimetric tracking of its entire path, of all its navigation. We have for receiving it, beginning as they enter to our economic exclusive zone. In addition, we are taking the welcoming of President Nicolas Maduro, the greeting of Venezuela to all of the Iranian people and their authorities, who have made this cooperation possible.
On Tuesday, the second tanker, Forest, was received by Venezuelan workers and authorities as it docked at the Paraguana refinery complex in Falcón State.
In the strategic alliance defined by our commander Hugo Chavez, who served in a context of siege, of blockade and sanctions, demonstrated how Venezuela and the oil industry at the time of 2008 would mark the same symbol of brotherhood, solidarity and cooperation. Today, it's been ratified by President Nicolas Maduro. On behalf of Venezuela, we welcome the second vessel.
The ship, named Petunia, entered Venezuelan waters on Wednesday, escorted by the Bolivarian Navy. The arrival of the 3 ships and Faxon, the 4th now in territorial waters, signals a deepening of political and commercial relations between Iran and Venezuela, both of which are legally sanctioned by the United States.
Debe saber nuestro pueblo.
Our people must know that the government of the United States, in collusion with Guaidó terrorist opposition, has for more than a year pursued all the vessels, all imports of supplies to produce gasoline in Venezuela, all the vessels to bring gasoline to its culminating point now in February, March.
The arrival of the remaining 2 Faxon and Clavel, which are monitored in real time, is expected in the coming days. Their arrival will complete the shipment of fuel, spare parts, and supplies to drive the production of the national fuel industry.
The United States is sending its military to Colombia next week. The U.S. Southern Military Command states that the U.S. Army's 1st Security Force Assistance Brigade will, quote, focus on logistics and intelligence capabilities directly supporting U.S.-Colombia counter-narcotics collaboration and information sharing. The statement adds that deployment has no specified duration, but the Colombian Armed Forces have said it would be a 4-month-long mission. The U.S. Army Brigade is to arrive on Monday. Senator Gustavo Petro responded to the news saying if they are going to fight against narco trafficking, they need to seek permission from the Congress, adding that they should start with the narcos who are entrenched in the Colombian state. Also commenting on the move, the FARC party said the Gringo Brigade is unconstitutional and a sabotage of peace, bringing the U.S. Army to priority areas for the implementation of Point 4 of the peace agreement on voluntary crop substitution shows that this government wants to perpetuate the war. Transport drivers demonstrated to demand stability and the reactivation of their sector, which has been greatly affected by the pandemic. On Wednesday morning, with red flags waved or placed on around 70,000 buses, intermunicipal transport companies protested to demand that authorities allow them to return to work amid the health emergency called to combat the coronavirus crisis.
It's been 3 months since we've been out of work, unable to drive buses. We have families, brothers, wives, starving children. We need to work. We don't have food. We need a solution.
Around 1 million families depend on income from this sector of the transport industry. And with the extension of lockdown measures amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, drivers are reporting labor irregularities at the companies during the pandemic and measures that damage the economy and stability of the workers.
The companies have violated the workers' rights. They have suspended contracts. It's been more than a month since we last got paid. We have children. We must pay rent. We must bring food to our homes. And neither the government nor the companies have proposed solutions to these problems.
Around 530 companies in Colombia asked for the reactivation of this activity. They assure that they count with biosecurity tools and distancing protocols for buses. They claim to be losing around $1,800 every day. The drivers ask for their salaries and ask the government for help. Companies owe them up to 3 months.
The second the pandemic began, the heads of the Magdalena bus company turned their backs on us and left us on our own. They owe us salaries from March, April and May, and they forced us to use our vacation time. They didn't want to pay us for that.
The transport sector asks the government to reactivate the activities from June 1st, the possibility to access to loans, a cut in the price of gas and tools, more support for formal employment, and more control over illegal transportation. We'll take a short break now. Join us again in a minute. Welcome back to From the South. More news now. Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, is urging global leaders to take steps to address economic devastation brought on by the measures taken in response to COVID-19. A high-level UN meeting brought together Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada, Jamaica's Prime Minister Andrew Holmes, and the UN Secretary General. Mottley expressed yet again that financial help was needed for middle-income countries.
We have many middle-income countries in our region and, in fact, among the small states of the world. And many of us are excluded from access to concessional funding, even in the midst of this pandemic, when we need access to money to boost our health systems more than ever, when we need access to credit to be able to offset the dislocation that has come from zero revenue from tourism, zero revenue from air travel. And what we are not assured of is early access to rapid tests that will allow our countries to open back up safely and to ensure that our population is not exposed in a way that is injurious to them simply because we want them to have their livelihoods in tourism. We accept, therefore, that the time has come for more than words at this stage, because time is not our friend. And indeed, we hope that this session will bring the world to the commitment that there is need for a global leadership initiative.
So what's happened is quite drastic and unprecedented. We've seen capital outflows. I had $90 billion. Christina just said $100 billion. So it's actually more than I thought. Absolutely unprecedented level of capital outflows, collapse of tourism revenues, collapse in commodity prices, particularly oil, collapse in activity, which leads to a very drastic reduction in government revenue at a time when expenditures are high and resilient, either for the debt service or for the health expenditures necessary to fight COVID-19. So in that context, we salute the decision made by the G20. The debt standstill. It's a very good first step, but more is necessary.
Moving on, a hearing via Zoom took place in Quito's Constitutional Court this Thursday after the country's universities presented a lawsuit against the budget cut announced by the government of Lenin Moreno. On May 12th, the court granted precautionary measures and requested the executive to suspend the cuts that could, quote, have a negative impact in the higher education institutions. President Moreno had announced a budget cut of $98 million in universities in the country amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Protests are currently taking place outside the court, took place earlier in rejection to the budget cut. Our correspondent, Denise Herrera, has more.
Hello, we are outside the Constitutional Court in Quito, where several organizations of students and teachers are now here gathering in rejection of the economic decisions made by the government. In this context, several organizations of human rights and students have presented an illegal action against these cuts in the education budget. As you can see here, the Ecuadorian students are now saying to the government that they have to stop with these neoliberal decisions that are affecting directly all the students and the teachers in the country. As you can see, the students are here taking all the measures in the context of the COVID-19 situation. They are rejecting these cuts in the education budget, but they are also saying to the government that they have to stop taking these neoliberal decisions that are affecting all the workers in the public sectors. As you can see here, the students also said that they are trusting in the Ecuadorian justice, and they said also that they are waiting that the Ecuadorian justice will take action, and they said that they hope that the Ecuadorian justice stop with these cuts in the education budget in Ecuador.
Authorities of Bolivia's de facto government have confirmed the collapse of the health system in the department of Beni in the country's Amazon. Beni is the second most hit department because of the pandemic after Santa Cruz, despite being one of the less populous departments with 500,000 inhabitants. The first case of COVID-19 was detected a month ago, and so far, the number of confirmed cases has reached 1,242 with 77 deaths. The morgues and cemeteries have overflowed because of the pandemic, while some bodies remain in people's homes. Beni declared itself in a state of a health disaster in the midst of corruption allegations. Social movements in Bolivia, along with the Legislative Assembly, are demanding that the Supreme Electoral Court set a date for presidential elections that were supposed to be held on May 3rd. We have more in this report.
Major concerns have been raised among social movements over a legal complaint which challenges the constitutionality of a law which sets a 90-day deadline to hold Bolivia's elections. Those social movements demand that the Supreme Electoral Court immediately set a date for the delayed ballot.
We want to hear from Mr. Salvador Romero. He needs to give a day and date for the elections. We make the Electoral Court responsible for any mobilizations. The Bolivian people can take to the streets because they want these elections.
The Constitutional Court has accepted 3 legal complaints issued by lawmakers representing the de facto government against the law that calls for elections within 90 days. Now the head of the Senate needs to argue in support of the law, and the Constitutional Court has 45 days to present a ruling.
We are waiting for the Supreme Electoral Court to provide us with the new date for elections, as it is expected of them. We have always respected the independence of our institutions, and we have to wait for the courts to do their duty.
Many suspect that this legal complaint by the de facto government is a scheme to further delay the elections and to remain in power unconstitutionally.
It is no coincidence that they are attacking the legislative bodies. They want to close down the assembly. That is why we have to warn the people. They need to be at the ready to defend democracy.
Social movements have declared themselves in a state of emergency until elections are held. But the de facto government continues to maneuver against the people's interest, all while the coup president and candidate, Jeanine Áñez, continues to place a distant third in all polls.
We're taking one last break, but stay with us. Welcome back to From the South, more news now. Brazil's federal police have started investigating a corruption plot inside Rio de Janeiro's healthcare system that involves the state's governor. On top of this, there's also mounting complaints about the government's security policies in the city.
Rio de
Janeiro is the state with the second highest number of deaths caused by COVID-19 in Brazil. In the midst of this health crisis, Governor Wilson Witzel, his wife, and the members of his administration have been accused of embezzling public funds from the state's healthcare system. The main scandal is the purchase of ventilators at marked up prices. This is a difficult situation that hurts the entire population because we don't have the necessary equipment. These ventilators they purchased haven't even been delivered yet, so we still have people who cannot be treated properly. In Rios favelas, 20% of the victims of COVID-19 died inside their homes, according to a recent investigation. But the pandemic is not the only thing threatening their lives. Last week, 14-year-old Afro-Brazilian Joao Pedro was playing with his cousins in his home when he was shot dead by Rios federal police.
This is a militarization problem. It's genocide. It stems from the racist acts of our own government. Both the state and federal governments, they do not consider our needs. They do not help us during a crisis, during a pandemic. They only shoot us down in any way they can.
On one side, there's a need for more hospital beds. On the other, police operations are increasing inside favelas.
State violence plus no access to healthcare is historical occurrence, and Afro-Brazilian movements have been documenting it and studying it. There is a direct relation between the two and its genocide, especially against the black population. But it affects everyone living under the poverty line, who are forced to live in favelas and lack access to healthcare while also facing state violence.
The state of Rio de Janeiro has registered over 4,000 deaths caused by COVID-19 since the pandemic started. Meanwhile, deaths caused by the federal police rose by 43% in April, according to the Public Security Institute.
Burundi's main opposition party has filed its submission to the Constitutional Court to contest the results of the May 20th presidential elections. The National Council for Liberty, led by Agathon Rwasa, alleges the polls were riddled with fraud and irregularities. He said if unsuccessful, he would take the case to the East African Court of Justice in Arusha, Tanzania. On Monday, the Electoral Commission announced that ruling party candidate Evariste Ndayishimiye won 69% of the vote, while Rwasa trailed behind with 24%.
We have had cases where deceased people have been mentioned as having voted because their voter cards were printed and distributed to people who went to vote in their place. If the court does not rule in our favor, then we will try to take our case to the East African Court based in Arusha.
In Iraq, the national lockdown imposed to combat the coronavirus pandemic has led to unexpected recoveries of local enterprises. Business owners say that ever since the lockdown started, they have not had to compete with cheap imports that had significantly eaten away at their markets. Many agreed that the silver lining during this crisis has allowed Iraqi businesses to prove they can not only compete with foreign products, but even outdo them in quality.
The situation has really changed. The borders were closed, so the demand for the Iraqi product increased. These days I'm getting new orders for plastic tubes faster than I can even produce them. Fortunately, it turns out that our products have better international specifications than the imported ones. The coronavirus crisis has allowed us to prove ourselves on the Iraqi market, or to prove that our products are sufficient for the Iraqi market in terms of product and quality. It also gave us more space.
Scores of angry workers have burned tires outside a plant owned by Nissan in Catalonia after it was announced that the company would be closing its factories amid the pandemic. On Thursday, the Japanese multinational automaker reported a $6.2 billion annual net loss, announcing it would shut its Barcelona plant and slash production. The decision will affect some 3,000 workers and 25,000 families, prompting protesters to block roads and burn tires around the plant's entrances. Unions are calling for the factories to be nationalized and for the security of the industry.
We're going to do everything possible to continue fighting. Nissan workers are going to keep up the struggle and stay in place. We're asking all administrations to support us to ensure that Nissan stays here, because we're going to turn this around. It's not a plan from today or yesterday or last year. It's a plan from many years ago. They starved us to death, and it's not that this plant is not profitable. No plant is profitable if it doesn't have production volume, and here they let us die. At this time of the COVID pandemic, I think it is a real shame.
After 2 nights of protests in response to the killing of George Floyd, the Minnesota governor has activated the National Guard. Protests escalated in Minneapolis on Wednesday night as multiple buildings were set on fire and several stores were looted. Demonstrators convened at 3 main locations: at the scene of the brutal murder, outside of the home of one of Floyd's killers, and outside of the 3rd Precinct Police Headquarters. 4 officers have since been fired, but organizations and individuals in the city have vowed to stay on the streets until the officers are arrested and prosecuted. Today marks 63 years since the victorious attack on El Uvero barracks in Cuba, Sierra Maestra. It was May 28, 1957, when Fidel fired the first shots, then began the advance of the platoons commanded by Raúl Castro, Juan Almeida, and Guillermo Garcia, while men led by Efigenio Ameijeras and Camilo Cienfuegos covered the flanks. The confrontation, a surprise attack, lasted 3 hours, the first on a large scale against the Batista regime forces. The battle represented an opportunity for the rebel army to seize numerous weapons and parks from the enemy. Numerous other battles would follow until the triumph on January 1st of 1959. The then Captain Raúl Castro said, "It gave us the status of an experienced